Right now, 3 different places on the map claim to hold the very same head: a mosque in Damascus, a church in Rome, and a cathedral in northern France. Year after year, pilgrims visit all 3, convinced they stand before the face of the greatest prophet who ever lived. Yet on its own, not one of them can prove it's the real one. That head belonged, according to tradition, to John the Baptist, the man Jesus Christ called the greatest among those born of woman. The dispute over it has been going on for more than 1,000 years. The site in Damascus is known as the Umayyad Mosque. Inside a shrine lined with green marble, it holds the relic venerated by Muslims, who call John Yahya ibn Zakaria. In Rome, the Church of San Silvestro in Capite claims another part of the skull, kept behind the altar among candles that never go out. In northern France, meanwhile, the Cathedral of Amiens has displayed since 1206 what it presents as the saint's own frontal bone brought from Constantinople after a crusade. 3 cities, 3 very old traditions. So far, no one has managed to piece that face back together in full. One question before we continue: is there a church near you that also claims to hold a saint's relic? Tell us its name and city in the comments and come back later to read the replies. You'll notice that people from cities far apart, with no contact with one another, guard similar relics with the very same quiet conviction. While you're at it, leave your own prayer request too, maybe for the courage to say a hard truth, or for a marriage in crisis. Later in this story, a promise made in front of guests will cost a king dearly. That scene is still ahead, so stay with us. And if you're watching this on your phone right now, do what that man did his whole life: pass this news along. He devoted his days to announcing that someone greater was coming, never once keeping that news to himself. Just below, swipe the comment field to the left. A button called Hype will appear. Tapping it helps this story reach people who haven't heard it yet. It all begins inside a fortress called Machaerus, built atop a dry hill east of the Dead Sea, with walls over 9 meters high and cisterns cut straight into the rock. Inside stood a palace built decades earlier by a king long dead, and a dungeon where a man dressed in camel hide had been held for months, never once taking back a single word he had said. Outside, the desert's hot wind beat against the stone. Unable to see any of it, a birthday feast was taking shape outside. The smell of roasted meat and wine being carried in, and in the distance, music beginning to play. To understand that imprisonment, and the unexpected ending of that feast, we have to go back decades, to a boy born in the desert of Judea, son of an elderly priest, and a woman no one expected to see pregnant again. He grew up eating locusts and wild honey, wearing rough hides, and chose to present himself to the world without a name of his own. He called himself simply the Voice. 6 months before the birth of Jesus Christ in the hill country of Judea, an elderly, childless couple, the priest Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth, received the news that they would have a son. Right in the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke, it is recorded that this boy would be born full of the Holy Spirit from his mother's womb, with the mission of preparing a people for the Lord. They named him John. The Church still holds to this day an extremely rare privilege tied to this story. Only alongside Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary does John the Baptist have his own feast for both his birth and his death. The first falls on June 24th. The second date, the one that concerns us here, falls on August 29th. About him, Jesus said something that sums up the whole paradox of his mission. Truly I tell you, among those born of women there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist, yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Those words are in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 11. He was at once the greatest of all the prophets, and the first to recognize that the one coming after him was immeasurably greater still. John grew up and went to live in the desert, among rocks and sand, far from the cities. He wore a rough tunic made of camel hair, tied with a leather belt, and lived on locusts and wild honey, as the Gospel of Matthew records in chapter 3. Crowds went down to the banks of the Jordan to see him, the sound of the flowing water mixing with the voices of those confessing their sins before stepping into the river's cold water. When priests from Jerusalem came to ask who he was, John answered simply, "I am the voice of one crying out in the desert, 'Make straight the way of the Lord.'" Words from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, echoing a much older prophecy from the prophet Isaiah. He never claimed to be the Messiah. He said only that someone was coming after him, someone greater, whose sandals he was not worthy even to untie. Flavius Josephus himself, the Jewish historian who had no reason at all to defend the Christian faith, describes John as a good man who urged the Jews to practice virtue, to act justly toward one another and with reverence toward God, and then come to baptism. For Josephus, the baptismal washing was not meant to forgive sins, but to purify the body of someone whose soul had already been purified beforehand through an upright life. It is an account independent of the Gospels, written decades later, and it confirms from outside the Christian tradition the very same portrait of a righteous man that the Gospels paint from within. It is this rite of baptism, practiced by John in the waters of the Jordan, that Catholic theology understands as the direct preparation for the Christian sacrament of baptism. John himself said that he baptized only with water, but that someone would come after him to baptize with the Holy Spirit and with fire. Words from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3. It is because of this connection that, to this day, he is the patron saint of baptistries around the world and of all who decide to convert to the faith. But John's preaching did not stay confined to the desert. It reached the ears of a powerful man, Herod Antipas, ruler of Galilee and Perea, son of Herod the Great, the same king from the biblical episode known as the Massacre of the Holy Innocents in Bethlehem, decades earlier. One detail about his title is worth noting. Antipas was never crowned king. From Rome he received only the title of tetrarch, ruler of a fourth part of an ancient territory. But the Gospels, following the popular custom of the time, call him king all the same. It was that very ambition for a title he did not hold that years later would bring him to ruin. Antipas had cast off his own wife to marry Herodias, who was, at the same time, his sister-in-law and his niece, since she had previously been married to a half-brother of his. The marriage violated the law of Moses, which forbade marrying the wife of a living brother. And John, unafraid of the power that man held, told him publicly the words that would change the rest of his life: "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Those words are recorded in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6. It's worth untangling a common confusion here. This Herod Antipas is not the same Herod who appears at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, in the episode of the Holy Innocents in Bethlehem. That was his father, Herod the Great, who had died years before. And Herodias' first husband, called Philip by the Gospels, appears under the name Herod in the writings of Flavius Josephus, probably because he held both names. It's easy to get lost in that family's tangled genealogy. What no source disputes is the reason for John's arrest: a public accusation made openly over a marriage the law did not allow. Herodias never forgave that accusation. She wanted John dead, but could not have it, because Herod Antipas protected him. The Gospel of Mark records something remarkable. Even though it troubled him, Herod knew that John was a righteous and holy man and liked to listen to him. That is why, instead of killing him, he had him arrested and sent to the most isolated fortress in his whole territory, Machaerus, built high on a hill east of the Dead Sea in what is now Jordan. Archaeological excavations carried out over decades have uncovered deep cisterns there, a ritual bath, and the foundations of the palace itself, confirming the account of the historian Flavius Josephus, who places both John the Baptist's imprisonment and his death at that very site. The months went by inside that fortress. John remained imprisoned, never once taking back what he had said, and Herodias remained waiting, never once giving up what she wanted. All that was missing was the right occasion, and it would come the day Herod Antipas decided to celebrate his own birthday with a great feast. Inside the dungeon of Machaerus, something unusual was taking place. According to the Gospel of Mark, Herod Antipas, the very man holding John prisoner, would go to him just to listen, even while troubled by what he heard. John did not soften a single word to please the jailer who was also his judge. Every time, he repeated the same truth that had brought him there in the first place. That was the one thing he did with unfailing constancy, saying, without change, what he had already said from the very start. There's a detail the Gospels record with care, even troubled, even uneasy. Herod kept coming back to hear John, and gladly, a jailer who liked the sound of his own prisoner's voice. It's hard to imagine a stranger picture of power standing before truth. He wanted to silence that man, and yet could not bring himself to stay away from his voice. The dungeon where John was held had a single narrow opening high in the wall, through which a thread of light entered for only a few hours a day. The cold of the desert night crept through the stones. Now and then, the distant sound of voices and music drifted up from the palace, reminding him that life at court went on, indifferent while he waited, not knowing for how long, inside that silence of stone. Outside the fortress, some of John's disciples stayed close by, waiting for news, able to do nothing but wait and pray for him. About a year, perhaps a little more, after the imprisonment, the day of Herod Antipas's birthday arrived. He decided to celebrate with a banquet inside the fortress itself, gathering, according to the Gospel of Mark, the great men of his court, the army officers, and the leading men of Galilee. 20th century archaeological excavations identified, within the ruins of Machaerus, a courtyard ringed by columns that researchers believe is exactly the space where that banquet took place. Torches burned against the desert night, the smell of roasted meat and wine being served at the tables, the sound of musicians playing for the most important guests of that region, far from the cold dungeon where John remained imprisoned. In the middle of the feast, Herodias' own daughter, whom tradition centuries later would call Salome, though that name appears in neither gospel, danced before all the guests. Something about that dance pleased Herod so much that he made before the whole court a loud oath, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you, even half of my kingdom." Those words are recorded in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6. In that culture, an oath made before weighty witnesses could not be broken without cost to the honor of the one who swore it. A king, trapped by his own vanity, in front of everyone he most needed to impress. The girl went out and asked her mother what she should request. And Herodias, who had been waiting months for exactly this chance, answered without hesitation. The girl ran back into the banquet hall and made the request in front of everyone, the head of John the Baptist, presented on a platter. The Gospel of Mark records that the king was deeply grieved. But only minutes before he had felt powerful enough to promise half his own kingdom. Now, faced with the request, he discovered the true price of that promise. Because of the oath he had made before his guests, he did not want to refuse it. He gave the order. Shortly after, the platter arrived at the banquet table in front of all the guests who, only a moment before, had still been raising their cups. The girl carried it to her mother. And when John's disciples heard what had happened, they went to the fortress, retrieved his body, and buried it, as the same gospel records. An ancient tradition, attested as early as the 4th century, places that tomb in the city of Sebaste in Samaria, where for centuries Christians went to venerate the site. Centuries later, Christian travelers reported having seen the Forerunner's tomb there, until, according to an account from the period, it was desecrated during the reign of the Emperor Julian the Apostate, and part of the relics were carried off even farther, somewhere between Jerusalem and Alexandria. What history records in the end is not the moment John died. It is the constancy of an entire life spent telling the same truth, even knowing its cost. From the first time he spoke before Herod to the last day inside that fortress, John the Baptist never once said anything different from what he had already said. It was for that faithfulness and for no other reason that the church calls him a martyr, not because he refused to deny the faith before persecutors, but because he refused to silence the truth before power. The Gospel of Matthew adds one more detail. John's disciples, after burying him, went to tell Jesus Christ what had happened. It is right after that news, in that same chapter, that Matthew tells of the multiplication of the loaves, one of the greatest miracles in the Gospel. It's as if the two accounts were stitched together on purpose. The voice that prepared the way falls silent, and immediately afterward, the one it had pointed to begins to feed the crowds. There is a second version of John the Baptist's death, written by a historian who was not a Christian. Flavius Josephus, a first-century Jewish Roman historian, in his book Jewish Antiquities, mentions no banquet, no dance, no oath. In his account, Herod Antipas feared that John's enormous influence over the people might spark a rebellion, and decided to have him executed as a matter of political calculation before that could happen. The two versions do not cancel each other out. A personal domestic motive could easily have served as the trigger for a decision that, in Antipas's own eyes, also made sense as a matter of state. And that same Flavius Josephus records another little-known detail that adds to the moral weight of it all. To marry Herodias, Antipas had cast off the daughter of King Aretas IV, ruler of the Nabatean people. Aretas, furious, declared war, and Antipas's army was utterly destroyed in battle. Josephus writes that many Jews of the time saw that defeat as punishment, and a well-deserved one for what Antipas had done to John, called the Baptist. It was not a Christian who recorded that interpretation. It was a Jewish historian decades later, with no interest whatsoever in defending the Christian faith. Antipas's story ends in downfall. Years later, spurred on by Herodias' own ambition, he went to Rome to ask the Emperor Caligula for the title of king. His brother-in-law, Herod Agrippa, accused him of plotting, claiming he had stockpiled enough weapons to arm 70,000 men. Caligula believed the accusations and banished Antipas to Gaul in what is now France. Herodias, refusing to abandon her husband, followed him into exile. Neither of them appears in history again. The king, who raised an oath before his guests so as not to look weak, ended his life far from everything he had because of that very same vanity. The fortress of Machaerus, the setting for this whole story, did not survive the passage of time either. It was destroyed by the Romans in the year 72 after Christ, during the war that would also end with the fall of Masada. Today only ruins remain, exposed to the wind atop the same hill where, once, a dance sealed the fate of a prophet. But John's body was not the only thing history lost track of. His head met an even more uncertain fate. Ancient traditions from the 4th and 5th centuries tell different versions. One says Herodias had it buried inside the fortress of Machaerus itself. Another says it was buried in Herod's palace in Jerusalem, discovered centuries later, carried in secret to the city of Emesa in modern-day Syria, and kept hidden there until it was revealed, according to a tradition from that period, in the year 453. From that point on, the relic multiplied, and more than one place began claiming to possess it. The first place is Damascus. A 12th century historian named Ibn Asakir wrote that the relic was found in a cave, beneath one of the columns during the construction of the Umayyad Mosque, ordered by Caliph al-Walid I, around the year 705. To this day, Muslims who venerate John the Baptist under the name Yahya ibn Zakaria come to pray at that shrine, because in Islam, he too is recognized as a prophet. The second place is Rome, where the Church of San Silvestro in Capite claims to have kept part of the skull since the 8th century. And the third is the Cathedral of Amiens, in France, which has displayed since 1206 what it presents as the saint's frontal bone brought from Constantinople shortly after the Fourth Crusade. There are also smaller fragments claimed in other cities across France and Germany, but these three are the oldest and most visited traditions. None of the three can prove on its own that it is the true one. The Catholic Encyclopedia itself, after gathering centuries of study on the subject, admits that the contradictions between the traditions are so numerous that the question resists any definitive answer. And perhaps that is exactly why the dispute never needed a winner. In Damascus, in Rome, and in Amiens, what repeats itself year after year is not the certainty of standing before the true object. It is the faith of standing before something that belonged to the man who pointed to Christ. There is an entire institution built around the name of John the Baptist, the Order of Malta. founded in the 11th century to care for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem, and which still honors him as its patron to this day. It was for that same order in Malta that the painter Caravaggio received the commission to depict the scene of the beheading. He finished the painting in 1608 for the oratory of the Cathedral of St. John in the city of Valletta. It is the largest canvas Caravaggio ever painted, and the only one in his entire life that he signed with his own name. Western culture afterward went even further than Caravaggio did. In 1891, the Irish writer Oscar Wilde wrote a play that turned the nameless young woman of the Gospels into a central character, driven by desire and revenge, and invented for her a dance that no ancient text mentions, the so-called Dance of the Seven Veils. That play became a few years later an opera by the German composer Richard Strauss, which grew into one of the greatest successes and scandals in the history of classical music. It's worth noting the contrast. The biblical account speaks of a nameless young woman carrying out a cruel request from her own mother. Popular culture centuries later turned this into a story of seduction. These are two very different versions of the same episode, and only one of them is found in the Gospels. Other great painters also returned to this episode over the centuries, like Titian in Italy, and the Frenchman Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, who painted the scene in a calm, almost silent style, quite unlike Caravaggio's drama. Every age found in the same story its own way of looking at it. Devotion to John the Baptist spread in a way few saints ever achieve. He is the patron of entire cities, like Florence in Italy, which named its baptistry after him. He is the patron saint of tailors, of herdsmen, and of all who work toward reforming their ways. And the feast of his birth on June 24th gave rise, back in medieval Europe, to the bonfires lit at dusk on every hillside, a tradition that crossed the ocean and still lives on, to this day, in the June festivals of several countries. Today, the Church celebrates the day the voice fell silent. John the Baptist once said, of Jesus Christ, words that sum up his entire life: "He must increase, and I must decrease." Those words are in the Gospel of John, chapter 3. It was not a lament. It was the only ambition he ever carried, from the desert to the dungeon, to fade away so that another could be seen. Perhaps that is why his head never stayed still in just one place. According to the different traditions, it would have passed through Jerusalem, Emesa, Constantinople, Damascus, Rome, Amiens. It never let itself be fixed to a single altar, as if it resisted even after death, becoming the center of attention. The three cities that lay claim to his relic will never reach an agreement, and perhaps that is not what matters. What remains of John the Baptist is not locked behind any altar. It is in every baptism celebrated, in any church in the world. Whenever a priest pours water over a small head and repeats, without knowing it, the very gesture John performed first, in a river, 2,000 years ago. Anyone baptized in any parish in the world is part of a chain that begins right there, in the waters of the Jordan, with a man dressed in hides crying out in the middle of the desert. His voice still echoes today over every baptismal font. The desert where he lived remains empty to this day. No statue marks the exact spot where he preached. No temple was ever built over the rock where he may have slept. It is as if the very landscape learned his lesson. The place does not matter. Only the voice matters, and where it points. The date of August 29th carries, in the Church's tradition, a meaning that goes beyond historical remembrance. It is traditionally also a day of prayer for those who suffer persecution because of their faith, and for anyone, anywhere in the world, who still today pays a high price for speaking the truth to power. When was the last time an uncomfortable truth asked to be spoken, and silence seemed safer? There is in anyone's life a moment much like that banquet, an audience watching, pride on the line, and the right word that would cost too much to say right there in front of everyone. John had every reason to choose silence. A king who protected him, a life secured within the favor of that very power. He chose instead the one sentence he knew would cost him his freedom, and later his life. The soul, perhaps, asks the same of us today, not the courage to stand up to a king. The courage, far smaller and just as hard to find, to speak a small truth that has been avoided for months to someone who needs to hear it. He never wanted to be seen. He only wanted to be heard, just long enough to point to someone else. Perhaps that is the only kind of greatness worth pursuing, not to be remembered for oneself, but for what, or for the one managed to point to. The church chose to set aside 2 whole days just for him, one to celebrate that he was born already full of the Holy Spirit, another to celebrate that he died having never betrayed that Spirit. Few saints received that double honor. None deserved it more than the one who existed entirely to point to another. John the Baptist's final lesson may be the simplest of all. Not every life needs to end remembered by a certain tomb, an exact date, or an undisputed relic. Some lives end up remembered instead for the direction in which they pointed. To this day, he is the patron saint of everyone who decides to change their life. Not because it was easy for him. He was, on the contrary, the man who paid the highest price for asking others to change first. If this story touched something silent inside you, share it with someone who needs to hear that it is still worth telling the truth, even when it costs something. John the Baptist, voice that prepared the way, who pointed to Christ and faded before him, teaches us to decrease so that he may increase. Saint John the Baptist, pray for us.